Welcome to the CSS Crash Course on Front End Now. This is where front end really starts to get interesting. We've taken our knowledge of HTML and we've really built it up into something where we can start styling it and we can start controlling the layout of our website. So without further ado, let's go have a look at what CSS is all about. So what is CSS? Well, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and cascading means to fall downwards in a certain way, and that'll make a lot more sense when we look into things like specificity and how CSS is ordered on the web page. But for now, all you need to know is that it stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now CSS controls the look and feel of HTML elements, and in order, it controls the look and feel of your website. So CSS is not a programming language. It isn't something that you can build anything with other than styling a website. Now this obviously changes when you look at some extensions for CSS, some things like Sass and Less and things like that. But for now, in its basic form, CSS is not a programming language. Now, as well as styling a website, it's also used to control the website layout. So very, very, very important. And you can do this through things like Flex and Grid and other things like that, which we'll show you later on in this video. Now, like we mentioned already, it isn't a programming language, but it can be extended with Sass or SESS or Less or something like that. But for the most part, it isn't a programming language. So why learn CSS? Well, CSS enhances the appearance of web pages, and with HTML and CSS alone, you could just stop your learning at that point and go off to Fiverr or Upwork or something like that and start working on websites and make a living just off that. That's how big CSS is to front-end development, and you could go really, really far with just CSS. So it's a really important language to front-end development. Another really important thing is it allows for responsive designs on different device types. So things like mobile phones, tablets, wider screens, TVs, you name it, any device that can use a browser, that can show a website, you are basically styling it with CSS to show on those devices properly. So very important for responsive design. And it is great for creating a really strong user experience. So if you have good CSS, if you thought about how the colors work, if you thought about how big the text is, and you thought about how everything looks the same from start to finish, if you go from one start of your website to the other, it still has a coherent feel and look, then that is a good user experience. So what are some of the tools needed to work on CSS? Well, one of the first things that I would recommend is a text editor. So a really simple and free one is called VS Code or Visual Studio Code, and that is used by the majority of developers, even professionally. And then another really good one is WebStorm. Now this is a paid one, and it's made by a company called JetBrains. And this is one that I use professionally at work and have done for a few jobs. And I've also used VS Code professionally at work as well. And I use them interchangeably, but this one is very powerful. But again, this is a paid one, and you can do what you need to do with this as well, but it's just preference which one you use. Another free one is CodePen. So you can go to codepen.io, create a new pen, and just start working on code, practicing code. Really simple. You don't need to set up VS Code. You don't need to pay for WebStorm. You can just go in and visually see what you're changing. And that's actually a really cool thing about CodePen. Unlike VS Code and WebStorm, where you have to set it up in a way that you can preview what you're working on, you don't need to do that with CodePen. It's already there, ready for you to preview, and you can just see the changes you're making instantly. So this is a really, really good one for beginners. And if you're really old school, you could use Notepad++. So if you want to feel like a hacker, or you're really cool, or if you're really into Linux or something like that, Notepad++ is just as good as the rest of them. It just doesn't have the same preview example that CodePen does. But yeah, it's a fun one to use, and you should try it out just for a laugh, even if you want to. But yeah, my recommendation would be CodePen or VS Code. CodePen probably to start with, and then eventually get VS Code. And the other thing you're going to need is a web browser. So my suggestion would be to personally get a Chromium web browser. So Chromium is basically anything that uses Google Chrome under the hood, but takes out a lot of the tracking scripts that Google use to track what you're doing, which is what's in Chrome. So things like Brave do that. They're very privacy focused. It's very good. Vivaldi is another good one. And then obviously you can use Chrome if you want. They're both very good. So any of the Chromium browsers are fine. It's your personal preference, but the inspection tools are best in class. They are the best dev tools for a front-end developer to use in a browser. And what a lot of people do is they use Brave, Chrome, Vivaldi, Opera, whatever else to do dev work, and then they use another browser for personal stuff. So something like Firefox they might use for personal browsing. But speaking of Firefox, they actually have a very good web browser called Firefox Developer Edition. And in fact, they have some really good tools for CSS. Some of these tools are better than Chrome and Brave even. So the grid tools and things like that. But the one thing about Firefox is any idea or feature they ever come up with, in about a quarter of the time, Chrome or Google come up with that feature with their hundreds of devs and basically steal it from Firefox. So they'll eventually have all these features far quicker. So you're not missing out too much if you don't go with Firefox, but it is a good one. But my preference is always with Chromium. So that's my advice for a web browser. Take it or leave it, but you do need a web browser and you do need a text editor to work on CSS. Now, what are the 3 methods for adding CSS? So this is how you actually add CSS to, let's say, for example, your HTML page. Now, you've probably started learning HTML. You've probably looked at HTML documents, but now we need to style it. And there are 3 ways we do it. So we can use inline CSS, so we directly add it into the HTML elements, internal CSS, where we use style tags within a single document, or we use external CSS, linking an external CSS file. And generally this is the most popular one. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick demo, and I'm going to show you how all 3 of these work and how you could go about adding CSS for yourself, and you can try and see which one is best for you. So let's go to VS Code and we'll have a look at the 3 main ways that we would add CSS to our file. So let's create a HTML page. So I'll use Emmet to spin up some HTML boilerplate, and let's add some HTML. So we'll add a button and we'll say click me. We'll open up the preview window so we can see the changes that we're making. So we can see we've added a button. Now, right now it's got no styling, but to add some styling to it, we can use the inline styling element. So we can go style and we can say background red. And what that does is that changes the styling of the HTML element in line. And this is called inline styling. So we'll put inline CSS here. So how do we style this internally now? So this is the second way to do it. Well, the way we would do it is just up here, we would add a style block, and we'll target this button element here by using a tag selector by choosing button, and then we'd open some curly brackets, and then we'll say background blue, and then we'll get rid of this inline styling, or in fact we'll just add another one, delete this and comment this out. And now you can see that this is a blue button, but we don't probably want it with black text, so we'll add some white text for it as well. And we're doing this using these style elements here, or the style block here. Now you can see that we've got the body block, the head, and you can add a style one as well. And this way you can style all your elements in here, and then you can do this all within your HTML file if you want. But there is another way. And this is the most common way of actually adding styling to your web page. So what I've done is I've created a new folder called CSS Crash Course, and it's as simple as that. And all you need to do is go in here, we'll create a new file, and we'll start with an index.html. And then I'll just populate it with some boilerplate HTML. So we'll go doc and then use Emmet and press tab, and it will create all our boilerplate for us. And then we will add a button element. So click me as before. We've got everything we need to for the boilerplate. And now, most importantly, we are going to create our CSS file. So if you go to new file again, and we type in style.css, you can call it whatever you want, by the way. It doesn't have to be style, but what is important is it ends in .css. That makes it a style sheet. And then We click enter on that, and now it automatically opens style.css, and we can add some styling. Now what we want to grab here is the tag element, which is button. So we want to be targeting button, and the way we do that is by typing button, and then we use open curly brackets or mustache brackets, whatever you want to call them, and then we add our styling. So we can add background green and color white, and now we've added our styling. So if you go back to the index.html and open the preview window, we can see that the styling hasn't been added yet. Now we did add some styling. We made the background green and the color white. So why isn't it added? Well, we need to link the two documents together, the style.css and the index.html. And the way we do that is we use a link element. Now this link element will bring these two together, but we need to add two attributes first. So the first one is rel, which tells the browser and the document what type of document we're linking. And we are going to say style sheet. And then we actually need to have the URL to the document. And it is /style.css. So /style.css. And instantly you can see that that style sheet has been targeted. Now there are some other things you can do. For example, we've got the body element here. We can target that as well. So if we go up here, we can target body and we can say background black. And now the background is black. What we can also say is we can align it to the center. So we can go text align center, and now it puts the button in the center. And you can see that not only have we styled the element, we've styled the website, and we've also started to control the layout. That is the power of CSS, and that is the power of being able to use an external style sheet. So with, for example, the style block that we had before, if you can imagine you're adding lots of styles all the way down, it can get really, really cumbersome, and it's going to look really, really messy. The same with adding it in line into the styling. If you start adding it for every HTML element and it carries on and carries on, it may start to look a little bit messy. But the most common way of doing it is adding an external style sheet where all the styling is contained somewhere else, and you go into that style sheet and you can add it all here and it automatically updates. So for example, if we want to change the background to orange, it'll do that. And it's just as simple as that. So that is the 3 ways to add styling to your style sheet, and it shows you the power of external CSS style sheets. So let's have a look at what makes up the syntax and structure of CSS. Well, CSS is very simple, and it's made up of selectors and declarations. That's it. So we'll have a look at an example of a selector. With here, it's the P element or the paragraph element, and similar into the example we just looked at, which was the body and button element tags. That's all it is. It's just the HTML element that you want to style. And this can come in many different forms, but in the most simplest of forms, it is a tag element like paragraph or body or button, like we just saw. Now that is the selector. You're selecting or targeting what you want to style. And then the declaration is actually the styling that you're passing to that selector. So for example, here it's color red, but in this example, in the bottom right, we can see that the selector is a heading element or a H1, and we can see that the declaration or the styling is color blue or font size 20 pixels. And it's honestly just that simple. You've got the selector here and the declarations here. That makes up the core of CSS. Now, another really important pillar of CSS is understanding what tags are, which we've just gone through, and I've just shown you body element P, and use them and style them. But there are a few others as well. Most importantly, class names, which is probably one of the most common ones, and IDs. So an ID essentially looks like this, a hashtag, and then the name of the ID. And then a class name is traditionally dot and then the name of the class afterwards. And you've already seen how tags work. That is the name of the HTML element that you want to target. So that is ID, class, and tag. And I'm going to show you how that works in practice in VS Code. So if we go to Visual Studio Code and we go to style.css, we can see that we're targeting the button element. But what we want to do is we'll want to go here and add a class name. So we'll add a class of custom. And to add a class name, all you need to do is dot and then add the name. So ours is custom, and you can see that that is staying the same because we haven't changed anything. We've literally replaced one selector for another, and that's all classes are, they're selectors. And we can change it now. So we can change that to red, for example, and that'll work. We can change this to black, and that will work as well. And that's how we add class names. Very simple, very straightforward. We add the class name here. But if we want to add an ID, so for example, we want to add the ID custom, you can see that the styling's gone now because this selector won't work with a dot custom. So to add a ID selector, what we do is we delete this dot and we add a hashtag, and it's working again. So we'll go back here and change the background to blue, and this is now working as an ID. So ID custom is now working again. And that is simply how you add IDs and class names to an element. It really is just that simple. So let's head back. So what is specificity in CSS? Well, this is a concept that is a little bit more advanced, but it is something that you should be aware of. And it is a concept that you would do well to remember, and it will help you solve some bugs in the future, no doubt. And a big benefit of being able to understand and use specificity is that you don't need to use important tags. Now, important tags are elements where you force this to get read first and you break the order. So as we mentioned earlier, the name of CSS stands for cascading style sheets, which means it goes downwards in order. So the last thing that gets added is actually the first thing gets read or gets read. And so sometimes you have a situation where you add some styling and it doesn't actually show. And one of the reasons is because of the order that it's written in. Something else is overriding it. So what people do is they add an important tag like this. So it's an exclamation point and then an important, and it forces the browser, it forces the CSS to show that styling first. Now, to avoid this, what we do is we write things in specificity. So what we do is we write things that are very specific. So in this example here, it says the ID of some text, and we're having to use an important tag. However, if you are more specific and you add, for example, the container element that this is contained in, which is a class name .container, you then don't need to use the important tag because now CSS or your style sheet can target this element and style it. And that is the importance of specificity. So the more specific you are, the higher chance your styling is going to override any other competing styles for that element. So again, this is a bit more of an advanced concept, but it is very important to hear it, to learn it, and to absorb it, because this will definitely come up in the future as some kind of bug in your code. And then you now know how to solve it or what could be the possible cause of it. So specificity is something that I would certainly practice and learn in the future. Media queries. So media queries is a really important part of CSS, and it really helps with controlling breakpoints in your layout, which means that it's really good for responsive design. So for example, you have a really wide screen and it goes to a certain point, then you want to add a media query to basically change that layout to how you want it. So you want to change it from a wide screen to a mobile view, for example. You would add a media query to potentially handle that. Now that is a very old way of handling these things. It's a bit of an old concept. We're moving along further now, and really nowadays it's more of a last resort to use a media query. It's less common, but it is good to know about them. You will probably still use them, but yeah, media queries, you want to try and avoid them as a best practice as much as possible. But if you really need them, absolutely use them because they are still useful today in front-end development. Now there's two types of media queries that you need to know about. These are two very important ones. They are max width, which are great for beginners. And this is one that I used a lot as a beginner. So this is when you get to a certain width in your browser, you then do this styling. And then there is min width, which means up to a certain minimum width, I want the styling to look like this. And then after this, I want the styling to be a certain way. Now, this is the mobile first approach to take. It is a mobile friendly approach to take as well. And this is the one that most mid-level and senior front-end developers use. Now, I'm going to show you examples of how this all works so you get a better idea of what media queries is all about. So let's go to our style sheet that we were just working on. To add a media query, what we do is we add an @ sign, and then we type in media, screen, and then we open some brackets and we go max width, and we'll choose a width. So we'll say 500, maybe 400 pixels. So we'll choose 500 pixels. And once we're happy with that, we'll add some open brackets, and this becomes our selector. And now let's add some declarations. Now, oddly enough, we do need to add another selector here. So we need to add custom again for this to be able to work, because we're targeting this. And it is good practice to keep your media queries near any element that you're trying to style, so it's all together in one place. So what we're saying is when this gets to 500 pixels, at a maximum of 500 pixels, I want this to have a different styling. So what we'll do is we'll add a different border to it. So we'll say 2 pixel dashed red. So you can see here that has been added. And then if we reduce the size of it, if it goes past the 500 pixels mark, oh, it won't let us go below any 500 pixels because I think we made it too big. So let's change it to 300 pixels. So then when we get to 300 pixels at a maximum width, it then does the styling. So this is very defensive type of styling. So when we get to 300 pixels, it then adds the styling. Now, to do this in reverse, if we say we already want this to have a border of 300 pixels, we'll take this styling out. We'll put it in here as the default. So that is the mobile styling that we want by default. And then what we'll say is we want this to be white once it goes past 300 pixels. So you can see max width is currently set to that. And then, okay, and then we'll just change this to min width. Brilliant. And you can see that the default styling now is 2 pixel dashed red for the border. And then when we slightly move this out past 300 pixels, it moves out of mobile styling and starts to go into desktop styling, which is a wider screen. And it changes the border to white. And that is the difference between a min width and a max width. So min width says it has to be a minimum of this width. And you can do other things other than width. You can do height as well. But for now, what's important is that you just want to focus on width to make sure that we cater for mobile devices and tablets and things like that, so we can change the styling and layout. So that is media queries for min width and max width. Now again, what I would do is I would code along with this video and practice this and try your own version of min width and max width, try your own version of mobile styling and see how you get on. And practice is the key here. That's the only way that you're going to learn these concepts and learn them fast, is by practicing as you go along, opening up CodePen or VS Code and just giving it a go. So let's head back. Now the other thing I want to show you is CSS display. Now this is a really important property within CSS. It unlocks so many important layout features, and if you want to control the layout, display is one of the core declarations that you need to use to do that. So I'm going to go back into VS Code and show you how that works. So if we go back to our CSS Crash Course, we currently only have one element. Now what I want to do is I want to add 2 elements. So I'm going to go here and copy and paste that, change this to class, go back to our style sheet, make sure this is also set to class, so it works just the same. So you can see that they're side by side, but we're going to play around with the layout a little bit. In fact, we might even add one more. So let's add another one. And we'll say click me 1, click me 2, click me 3. And I want to put these in some kind of layout or wrapper. So we're going to take these out, make a div element, paste that in, make sure these are indented correctly. And then I'm going to add a class name of container. I'm going to copy that. And a div is essentially a way of containing these elements. You can call it whatever you want. So you can call this section as well if you want to do it semantically, but we'll call it a div for now. So we'll take this container, we'll go back here, and what we'll do is we'll go to our style sheet and add a new selector, which is container, and then add some styling. So the display property is super important. So for example, if we add block, nothing changes. And that is because by default, it is already using display block. Display block generally is the default display styling. But if we want to change that, we can do. So for example, if we want to use, let's say, flex, it then changes the styling. Now flex is very, very important. It is the way that the majority of websites are styled nowadays. It's usually either flex or grid. Those are the two main ways that styling is done. So that's why it's really, really important that you understand display, because that is how you're going to dictate the layout of your documents and your websites. So for example, from here, we can then choose the direction of the layout. So we can say column, and then it all goes into a column, or we can say, no, you can go back to a row as well. That is the power of the display property and being able to add flex. Now, obviously flex is a lot deeper. You can go into a lot more of a deeper understanding into how flex works. But for now, all you need to know is that display is really important, and there's a whole bunch of properties you can use. If we look here, there are table display properties, all to do with tables. So caption, table column, column group, table row. You've also got inline elements as well. So you can do inline block, inline flex, inline flexbox, and inline table. And the benefit of inline block or flex or whatever else is that you get the benefits of block, flex, flexbox, table, grid, for example, which isn't that supported, but you can add that, is that it gives you the benefits of these other properties like flex, but without it being a block element. So it'll make it inline, which means you can have them all together. So for example, I can then add inline flex, but if I just do normal flex, it then changes the styling because it is slightly different. So display is very powerful. It is your layout styling, and it is really worth playing around with and practicing and getting into. So that is the display CSS property. So CSS position, what is this property? Now the reason why I've brought this up, because it is a really important property that you should know about. Now if you're learning CSS and you want to move things around, you may feel like everything works as a block, everything's very rigid. But what if you want to take something out of the layout and literally move it to any pixel that you want to? You can move it anywhere around the web page. Well, you can do with this position property, and I'll show you exactly how you can do that very quickly. So if we go back to VS Code, we can see that we have our container property here, and we have these elements. Now, what if we want button 2 to be in the top right corner here, or if we want it to be in the bottom right corner? Well, we can do that using some styling, and more importantly, the position property. Let's first add an ID here. So we'll go ID because we want to specifically target this, and we'll say button 2. Grab that, go to here, and we'll add button 2. And what we'll say is we want to add position, and we'll say absolute, and we're going to move it across the page. Now you can see immediately it's gone missing, and where it's gone is to the top left corner. You can see that button 1 has gone slightly missing. That's because we're using position absolute, which basically takes it out of the order of the website, the current order, and it's moved it just completely out of that, and we can do whatever we want with it. We can move it wherever we want. So for example, if I use the top property, which is only really available if you use position absolute and a few others, and we'll move it down 20 pixels, and you can see that it has gone on top of button 1. Now I want to move it right down. So what I'm going to do is, rather than using 20 pixels and try to incrementally push it all the way down, I am going to change this to bottom, and this is going to move it all the way down to the bottom. Now that's all well and good, but it's not in the bottom right corner like I originally wanted. So to do that, we then say, I also want it to be right 20 pixels. And what this does is it moves it into the bottom right corner using this magical property position. Now, if I didn't use these 20 pixel values, so if I change this to 0, you can get a better idea of what's going on. It has gone right into the bottom right corner here. And it's only because I've said I want it to be 20 pixels from the bottom and 20 pixels from the right that it is where it is. And you can choose wherever you want to put it. So for example, if I want to put it 200 pixels away from the right, it'll do that. If I want to do 40 pixels, it can do that. And that is the power of using position properly. Another good one is if we change this to top and then we set the position to fixed. And what this does is it makes this element here completely fixed to the page. So it won't move as we scroll. So then if I go to here into the body element and I increase the height of the page to 5,000 pixels, for example, you can see we've now got a scroll bar. And if I start scrolling down, you can see that this is fixed to the page. We're halfway now through 5,000 pixels and it's still with me. That is the power of the CSS position element. And we've gone right back to the top and there are the other elements that were at the top of the page. So it's an amazing element. It's really good to learn and there's all kinds of cool things that you can do. And there's other cool concepts that we'll go into in later videos. But as a very early starting point, it's really good to know what CSS position is. The CSS box model. What actually is this? Now, this is something that you may have already heard of, or you will definitely need to know about in the future. It isn't super important, but it is something that might come up in an interview. It might be asked as like a trivia question in an interview. So it is good to keep a mental note of this, and it might actually help you with some bugs in the future. So the CSS box model is something that wraps every single HTML element on your website. It is the order in which margin, border, and padding wrap around your content. And that's essentially what it consists of: padding, border, and margin. And this image basically shows you that the first thing that surrounds your element is padding. And then outside of that is the border. So if you add padding, it actually creates some distance from the border and the content, which can be really useful. And then beyond the border, you have margin, which is essentially used to space your element away from other elements. So it's a really good layout style to use. So margin is great for spacing and arranging layout. And padding is great for the element itself and giving spacing within the element. So they're two very different things, but this is the order that they work in the box model. So memorize this image, understand it, and if you do get asked about it in an interview, you now know what it is. And you can practice it and inspect it in your dev tools in Chrome or Brave or Firefox, and you'll see exactly this playing out in front of you. And that is the CSS box model. And now we come on to the bane of all front-end developers: how to center your code with CSS. It's a meme and it's also a mark of pride once you learn it. It's a really good milestone to know that once you learn these things, that you have accomplished actually quite a lot as a front-end developer and learned quite a bit about CSS. But what are these elements that help you center CSS or center with CSS? Well, one of the biggest ones is Flexbox or Flex. That's a big help on how to do it. There's margin, text center, and absolute. Now, it's all well and good me saying these 4 things, but I'm actually going to show you how all 4 of these help you center your elements. So let's go ahead and have a look at how they can help you center your elements in Visual Studio Code. So let's just clear some of this styling for now to make it a little easier. So we'll get rid of that. And we now have this element. So we want to center this. So we've got the container element here. We can use Flexbox on the container element, which we already are. We're using display flex. That's brilliant. And we can use flex to center this by simply doing justify content and then center. And then that puts it into the center of the page for us. Brilliant. Well, that's one way. What are the others? So another way of doing this is text align center. Now it won't work here because the width isn't full. And what I mean by that is that the element itself isn't fully across the whole way. So we do width 100% and display block, and we get rid of this, and it works. And the reason why it works is because a block element at 100% width then can be centered with text align center. If I change this to start, you can then choose where you want to center this, at the start or at the end. And we are going to choose the center. And that is the second way in which you can style things to be in the center. So another way we can center this is by using margin. So we'll turn this back to flex, so it goes back into the left corner. And what we'll say is we'll give it a fixed width. We'll give it a width of maybe 300 pixels. And then we'll say margin auto. Now, obviously, the size of this has exceeded the size of these buttons. So we'll change that to 200. And then you can see that this is now centered inside. But the margin is squeezing it a bit. So we can increase this to 220 or 240 until it's correct. And there you go. And that is the third way in which you can center styling in CSS. And let's go to the fourth way. So the fourth way we're going to style this is using position absolute. And I'll show you how we do that now. We'll delete a display flex and we'll go position absolute and we'll go left 0 and simply right 0. And there you go. We're now saying that we want this to be on the left and the right. It's almost like two magnets facing each other. It kind of just keeps something in the middle. So you've got this now just hanging in the middle between the left and the right using position absolute. So if, for example, we change this to fixed, it still works with fixed as well. You can scroll down and it's still there as well. So that's how you center your elements in CSS using these 4 tips and tricks. And that is the 4 ways that you can center in CSS. There are others, but these are the 4 key ways. Now, another important part of CSS is looking at pseudo selectors. So this is how you handle different states of CSS, usually something to do with interacting with an element. So you've got your hover state. So if you hover over something, I want to style it in this way. If you focus on something, I want you to style it in this way. And it's the same with links. If you have a link, if you visited a link, how do you want to style it? If you hover over a link, how do you style it? And if you're currently hovering over a link and it's active, how would you style it? And there's different stylings for different elements, but these are the core ones. And then you can also target different children. So first child, now nth child. Now what makes a pseudo selector are these 2 dots here. So once you add these 2 dots and then add the pseudo selector, which is hover, focus, whatever it is, then that makes it a pseudo selector. And I'm going to show you exactly how that works in VS Code. So a very simple pseudo selector is, for example, take custom. So we'll add another custom selector here and we'll change the background to black. So this is an additional style. And in CSS, if you want to add a pseudo selector, generally you have to add it on a new line. So here we're adding it here and we'll say on hover, I want the background to change to black. Now I'm going to comment this out for now because I just want to show you how it currently works. So as it currently works, when you hover over these, nothing changes. But when I hover over them now, it should change the color to black. Now, a very common thing that people like to do, or front-end developers should do, is you change the cursor icon to a color that you can basically notify if something is interactable or not. So if I go here and I type in cursor pointer and now I hover over it, you can see that the cursor itself has changed. It's changed to like a finger with a glove, which is the cursor pointer. Now I want to add another form of styling and you can stack these up. So I'll add a new one, copy and paste that, and I'll change the styling to green. I can delete that now. And I'll change the pseudo selector to focus. So focus is essentially when you tab onto an element and you focus on it. So for example, if I tab onto these, you can see the styling immediately changes. It's changed the background color to green and I tab again and it does that for all of them. And I can change it to something like purple and it changes it to purple now when I focus on it. And that is the power of pseudo selectors. So I advise you to go through the list I put in the slide and play around with all the different types. So hover and focus on some of the most common ones you'll be working on as a front-end developer. So these are really good ones to learn and practice with. So let's have a look CSS animations. Now, this isn't something necessarily that you're always going to be using or always doing, but it is something really good to know because it adds a lot of excitement, a lot of pizzazz, and a lot of interesting styling to your website. Being able to animate, for example, a button in a certain way or a website in a certain way to just give it a better user experience. So I'm going to go into the code and show you how I would add some really basic animations to our existing code. So if we open up our style sheet and we have our button element here, currently when we hover over something, it goes black. But what if we add an animation? So if we hover over it, one of these buttons, all these buttons in general, just fade out. So let's do that now. So the way animations generally work, there are multiple ways to add them, but one of the most simplest ways is to literally just add a one-line CSS style here with transition, and that is the important property there, transition. And you can set your properties within here whatever you want. So we're going to target opacity and we're going to set the animation timer to be 1 second, and we're going to set it to ease out. And the reason why we want it to ease out is because we're hovering over it. Now, if it was something where an element was entering in some way, then we'd change this to ease in, but it makes sense for it to be ease out because we'll be hovering over it. Now, if I hover over them now, they don't do anything because we haven't set a hover effect on here and we're not doing anything with opacity, so there's nothing for it to transition. So if I go here now and I set the opacity to 0, watch what happens. Now, if I hover over something, it then fades away. And that is as simple as animations get. And you can build this up and do whatever you want. So if I change this to color and then I add color red here. So we've got the color as red here. I'll get rid of opacity for now. So we've got the color white here and then we're transitioning it to color red. And that's what we're targeting here in the transition style. So let's hover over it now. And you can see it now transitions the text color. And that is how animations on the most basic fundamental level work in CSS. And one of the final things we're going to look at is something that is most certainly going to come up in an interview of a junior level at some point. You are going to be evaluated for your code if you use this or not. So this is a very important starting concept when using HTML. Now, this isn't something that is a core part of CSS. This is something that front-end developers have imposed on the community. This is something that is considered a best practice for using with CSS, and that is just to help organize your class names. Because like I said, class names are the most common way you're going to be styling your CSS. So this is called the BEM methodology. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. And the reason for it is this is the most semantic way of styling or naming your styling or naming your selectors. Now, semantic essentially means it's in the most human readable way. It's the most obvious and straightforward way. So if you read this, you know exactly what it does. It's in the header. You know that this is something to do with a header. That's the block. That's where it's from. And then it tells you the element that it's targeting. So this is a title. So this could be a H1. It could be a heading element of some kind. So you get an idea of what it is. So a title. And then it tells you what exactly you are modifying. And this gives you an idea exactly of the style that you're about to apply. So it's saying, I want to make the title in the header red. And that's why this is such a good best practice to learn and to basically have with you as you code along and style your CSS. Now I'm going to show you exactly how you would use this in practice and how you can build it up. So let's go to VS Code and show you how BEM works. So this is our style sheet so far. We've got a lot of styles on here, but we could actually do one better. So we've got custom here, which doesn't really say much about anything. So this is something that we could definitely change. So let's go back here. One thing we can say is that this is within the container, but container doesn't really say anything either. It's not very semantic. It doesn't really make sense. So we can change this to header as a semantic element instead of a div. And then we can also change the class name to header so it makes sense as well. And then what we can do is we can change the class names here to header underscore button. So remember that it's a double underscore. So it's 1, 2, and then button always. And we'll do it again here, header underscore button. Make sure it's a double underscore, and we can copy and paste that and put it into there as well. And you can see the styling has gone now because the class names are different to what is styled. So let's go into here and let's change this container one back to header, and let's change these to header button so that these all go back to normal. Right, so now that we've got that styling all connected up again, we can see that we've got our block here, which is header, and then within that we have a button within the header, and we've got all of these. Now if we want to add a modifier, so for example we want to add another class name, you can do that. So for example, for the first one, if I want to add a modifier, I would simply leave that there, add another class name, keep it the same, but then I would add a modifier. So I'm going to change the modifier to border. So if I go here now and we have header button, I'll copy and paste that, go down here. I can delete all of this because I don't need it. And then I will go and add the border modifier. So make sure that it's a double dash. Whenever you add a modifier, it is a double dash and then the modifier name here. And then we add our styling. So I'm going to style the border. So we're going to do, let's do 5 pixels dashed green. That's a nice contrast, isn't it? So we make sure that's correct. Nothing seems to have changed. So header, button, border, header, button, border. So now let's see why it isn't showing. So if we add an important tag here, we can see that this is actually correct, but the problem is specificity, that it isn't actually specific enough to be able to target that. So how do we correct that modifier? So what we do is we just grab this styling here and we add it before that. And you can see that if we leave a space, it doesn't work. But if we connect them together, what it's saying is that this is the parent class and this is a sibling class because it's connected to it. Once you disconnect that by adding a space, it then doesn't consider it a sibling class. So let's add these together, and now that is working as intended. And in fact, it makes a lot of sense because you've got the original class here, which is the block and modifier. You've also got the block and element here, and now you're adding the block, element, and modifier alongside it. So this makes a lot of sense because you've got the block element class name here, and then you've got the modifier class name here as well. And you know exactly what's happening. It's a lot more intuitive and it makes a lot more sense. And you can choose which one you want to modify. So if I don't want to modify the first one, I can then say I want to modify the third one. And it works exactly the same. And it's something that's really reproducible, and you can add this anywhere, and it's a great way to change state as well. And that is block element modifier, a really good best practice to use. And that concludes the CSS crash course on Learn Frontend Now. That was a whirlwind tour of CSS that gives you a huge overview of what is involved with CSS. Everything that you've covered here is enough for you to start doing projects as a freelancer and start doing work as a junior front-end developer for any company out there. It will help you in interviews and it will help you take on projects of any size once you know those fundamentals. So take everything that you've learned here, start practicing and playing with it in CodePen or VS Code, and just play with the elements, see all the options that you have to modify and style different elements, and just go through them one by one and have some fun. which is one of those great things about CSS. It's very visual, it's very exciting, and it's a lot better than just staring at black and white text when you're just playing with HTML. You now know what CSS is and all the very, very many ways that you can apply it. CSS Flexbox. Now this is a game changer for your CSS. Once you know this, this is probably one of the few skills that will take you right from junior all the way to senior and even lead. This is one of the main ones you're going to be using day in, day out. So let's go take a look at what CSS Flexbox layout actually is. Well, it goes by a couple names. It's known by Flexbox, or its older name, Flexible Box Layout. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful, but everyone calls it Flexbox, so that's all you need to worry about. Now, it's a really, really powerful tool for creating flexible and responsive layouts, which I'll show you in our demo. But the main criteria for this is that it creates a flex container. So it creates like a box container, and within it, you can do all kinds of stuff. So you can sort out the alignment, the spacing, and the distribution of all the items within it. And it's so simple, so quick to do. I'll show you exactly now how amazing it is. So here we go. I've got a HTML file here with some basic HTML styling and some basic flex layout markup or HTML. And what we're going to do is we're just going to have a look through each flex property. So we're going to have a look at the very first one, which is just creating a Flexbox container. So let's go here to example one, and I'll show you how this all works. So we've got a class name called container, and within it, we've got three elements. So these three here on the right in the preview, and you can see that they automatically just stick to the left, or flex start, or alignment start, which means like the furthest left it can be. And this essentially activates Flexbox. So we go to container here, which is the default, and you can see that it's got the display flex here. Now, if you were to change that to display block, you can see that that all completely changes because flex is no longer activated. So if you ever want to use flex, make sure it's always display flex, and then it works. And it should put everything into the same row. So for example, if I then go here and I add something else, so if I add a paragraph element and I go, fourth element, it then is going to add it here. And then if I add another one and type in fifth element, you can see that it just adds it in a row. But if I do display block, it then adds it in a column. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in one single column. So 5 rows in a column. Now we don't want that. We want it as flex, and we'll delete this. But you get the idea now of what a Flexbox container is. It literally is a box that you create using display flex, and within it, you can then start using Flexbox, which we'll do now. So one of the coolest and easiest ways to set the direction of your content, and it's great for doing some responsive styling, is flex direction. So let's go down here, and we can see that they've added an inline style of flex direction column. And what that does is that just turns it into a column like display block. But the benefit of this is then you then get to add all your Flexbox styling with it. So if this was a display block, you wouldn't get those benefits. But you can also flip this back around again. So you can switch this back to a row as it was before, and it will look the same as above. But if you want it as a column, you can change it with using the flex direction property here and set it to column. And I can show you how we do that here in CSS, because this is done inline. So if we go under here and we go flex direction column, it then puts it all into a column, and I can put it back into a row here as well. And I can change the directions in which the elements go. So you can already see how much control you're starting to get. So we'll get rid of that. And let's have a look at some justify content. So justify content is one of the most common ones which you use to arrange the spacing between the elements. So if I go down to here, and you can see justify content space between. You can also do things like space around. So then it adds some spacing around the elements. But generally you want it edge to edge. So you're going to want the spacing between. So then it adds this really lovely spacing. This is great in navigation elements. So you can imagine your logo is here, you've got some menu here, and you've got some social media icons, or maybe some login, log out buttons here. It's a really great way to arrange your layout really, really quickly without having to use precise pixel calculations for which way you want to do it. You can literally just type in this and it automatically does it all for you, which is brilliant. Now, this is horizontal alignment. Now what we want is vertical alignment, and that's where you use align items. So align items here, we've set it to flex end, but if we sent it to, and you can do flex start, which puts it basically to the top. And then if you want, you can even put it in the center. So if you just type in center, it then centerizes it. And then if you pair it with justify content and do center, so it takes it and puts it in the center, and then you have absolute styling in the center. And it's only using 2 properties, but because you're using a Flexbox container, it's very, very quick and simple to do. So I'll put that back. So let's have a look at Flex Wrap. So Flex Wrap is the idea that essentially you can wrap items here as you close it. So you can see how it naturally just wraps onto the other lines. So if you go fully out, you can see that it goes as far out as it can, and then by itself, it decides to wrap it. And this is a property that can help you avoid having to use media queries. So, you know, as a CSS best practice, you generally want to avoid using media queries as much as possible. So a flex wrap property is a really, really good CSS property to know. And all you do is you type in flex-wrap and then type in wrap, and that works. So if we go all the way up here and we go to container and I type in flex wrap, wrap, and then I start closing this down, you can see these are all wrapping now onto the next page, and it just automatically just looks way better. It automatically just wraps, and it's a great way to have some default responsive styling in your code. Now the next one we want to look at is align content. So align content is another CSS property that basically allows you to decide how you want to align your properties on the flex axes. So if I then do space around, it then is keeping the horizontal alignment to the center here, but it's spacing around it. So if I space between, it's still keeping that horizontal alignment and then pushing it up. And that's essentially how that works. Let's go to flex, grow, shrink, and basis. Now this is a really handy one. So you can distribute space between elements and you don't have to think about, oh, this should be X percentage or this should be so much percentage wide. If you go here and we'll go to number 7, you can see that the middle box, which is box 2, has a flex grow property of 2. And what that means is compared to its neighbors or its siblings, it is taking up twice the amount of space no matter what. So if I extend this as large as I want, you can see that this just takes up as much space. And you know, if I had an infinitely wide monitor, this would just carry on stretching and carry on stretching. And that is all calculated with these flex properties, so you don't have to think about that. And so we could change that. So the first one then is 3, and then we can change the middle one to 1. So then the first box essentially has 3 times the flex grow as the others, and it will always be 3 times bigger. And that's a great way to distribute space. So we'll then return that back to 1 and put that back to 2. You can also change it to flex shrink as well, which basically just does the opposite. So if I do flex shrink, I want it to be essentially twice as small as the other boxes. So then it takes up twice as less space. So then you see box 1 and box 3 essentially taking up more space. And those are some of the main ones that you need to learn about that. So yeah, those are some of the most important ones. Now, flex basis is an interesting one. That essentially sets the initial size of it. So if I go flex basis, in fact, let's do flex basis here. I go flex basis and I want to set it to 100 pixels. So what that's saying is I want it to be 100 pixels only. You see that? So when you're using flex, grow, shrink, and basis, you can add set elements in there. So for example, you might have a layout that should only be a certain width. So you set that to 100 pixels and the rest can grow. And so this is set to be twice as large as its sibling, which is box 3. And box 3 is taking up the default space that it has. And this is only taking up 100 pixels. And then this is basically clearing up aside from that. So that is basically flex, grow, shrink, and basis in a nutshell. Obviously play around with these and you'll get a hang for these way more. Flex, and then the next one is order, which is a really great way to order stuff around in the CSS rather than in the HTML. You've got box 2, box 1, box 3 here. Normally this would be the order it would naturally be in, because that's the way the HTML is. This div is on top, this div is in the middle, and this div is third. So 1, 2, 3, that makes sense. But if you decide that this very last box should actually be the first one, well, you can just change the order to 1 and that to 3, and then box 3 becomes the first in the order. And it's a really simple trick. It's using just order double colon. So order double colon and then a number, and you set the order whatever you want. It's very handy when you're working on an older code base and you want to arrange the order of something, but you can't exactly change the HTML. It's a really good get out of jail free card. And there you go, ladies and gentlemen, that is Flexbox CSS. I've taken this skill that I had as a junior and I've been using it nearly every day since then. It is a fantastic skill to learn, and I am without a doubt you'll be using this in all your projects going forward on front end now. So open up VS Code, CodePen, and have a play around, because now you know Flexbox CSS. Now a really handy thing to learn is CSS pseudo classes. Let's go take a look at what those are. Now you're probably wondering what actually is a pseudo class. It kind of sounds complicated, but that is the furthest thing from the truth. So the best way to sum up pseudo classes is looking at the two main ways that you can use them. So the first one is to style elements based on their state. So whether you're hovering over something, whether you're focusing on something, that kind of state. So basic interactions. Then there's the next type of pseudo selectors. So this is based on a relationship in an element. So element relationship, is it a sibling of that element? Is it in the right order? Or is it basically saying, I want everything else except for this element? Those are the two main ways that you can use pseudo classes. This is a really helpful way to style your website based on interactions and based on relationship and order. So let's go have a look and see how pseudo classes actually work. So I have Visual Studio Code open right now, and I've got the preview window open to show HTML document I've created, and it's showing how pseudo classes work. And I've got the styling all in with the HTML. So let's go over the first one, which is the most simplest form of pseudo class, and that is hover. That's the simplest interaction. So if you hover over something, you can change the styling of it. So right now, let's go down to hover, which is line 28 to line 30. And you can see we've set the background color to this dark green, but you can change it to whatever you want. So you can change it to red. So then if I hover over it, it changes to red. If I want to add a border, for example, I can say 5 pixels dash. So then if I hover over it, not only can I change the background, but I can change the border, and you can stack up as many of these as you want to do. But that is the core thing. And the way you do pseudo classes is generally these 2 dots here. So you can see 2 dots here, and then you add the pseudo class that you want. So in this case, it's hover. So I'll do one from scratch. So I'll delete this, and then if I hover over, nothing happens. So I'll write this from scratch just to show you how to write a pseudo class. So button, that's your normal class name, and then add background black. So we say that we want the background to be black, but now that's changed it as the default, but that's because we haven't added a pseudo class. So if we go here and we then change this to hover, you can see it's gone back to the default, which is up here, the background color. And we've added a pseudo class for hover. So we hover over now, and there you go. That's how you add a pseudo class. So it's the 2 dots here, and then you add whatever you want for your pseudo class. So that's one of them. So let's have a look at the focus. So the focus element is using a double colon as well, similar to the hover. So to style it, we go here to line 32, and it's got a double colon and focus. So when you tab over it, it gives this orange outline, this orange brownie outline, and it's an input, so you can type into it. And it's the same as this button element here. You can focus on that as well. So if you tab onto that, you've got an outline here. So here, if we want to change the styling, we've already got focus here. Let's change this to red. And if we tab on, it hasn't changed, but I suspect that's because the default outline in the browser is actually 2 pixels as well. So if we were to change this to slightly larger than the outline, you should see it. And there you go. So you can now see the border styling that we've added just on this pseudo class by making it larger than the outline. Now, when I say outline, this is a default styling added by browsers. So if I change this back to 2 pixels and go over it, you won't see anything changes. But if I type in outline 0, you will now see the red because I've taken away that default browser styling. So be aware of that when you're working with pseudo classes, that you do have to think about things like outline interfering with the styling. So if we delete that now and just make sure that the size of the border is slightly larger, that'll work as well. So now we focus on, it's got a new border. So let's move down. Now, hover and focus are 2 of the main ones, but there are others as well. So there are things like nth child. So if we go down to here, so nth child is the ability to style based on the relationship. So nth child here is very similar to hover and focus, but this is the second part of pseudo classes that we talked about in the presentation. And that is that these focus on your relationship to the element. So in this case, nth child odd, this is saying every odd element in this list, style it in this way. So if we go here and we add a border, 5 pixels dashed red, and it's saying every other element that's odd, so 1 and 3, and 1 and 3 and 5 here, now have a border, a red border. So I can change this to 1 pixels just to make it a lot simpler. And then I can have a background of purple to make it even clearer. So you can see here that we've got a background of purple on all the odd ones. And I can then, on the even ones, I can change that to gold. And you can see how you can style based on relationships very easily. So the nth child is very, very powerful. It's a great one to use. And by itself, even if you aren't using odd and even, there are other versions of nth child that you can use. So you can say, let's say, for example, we'll target the unordered list and go li nth child. And so to style an nth child, just put in a number of 3 or something like that, and you should be able to style it. Now be aware that you may have to be more specific if you're trying to override these others. So for example, if I comment these out, I shouldn't have a problem. So I can go to 2 and then 1, and it just goes through the whole list and styles all of them based on the number I put. And it just chooses the nth child. So nth meaning it's like a mathematical term, and the number of n, so which is like an algebraic kind of like term. Now you don't need to know maths, but it's just a CSS term that they use that it borrows from maths, even though there's not really maths involved here. So number 3, number 2, and then if I was to add the even back, you can see that that might not work. And that's because this is overriding it, because again, cascading style sheets, this comes after, so this will get read first and it will override this. But if I then put this after here, this is now in the other cascading order and will get read first, and this will get essentially read over the other one. So the order in which you put these does matter. So we can take this out for now. We don't need it. We can add this one back. Brilliant. Okay, so that is nth child. Now first child and last child, if we go here, very simple. It's basically nth child, but you only select the first one and last one, so you don't have to worry about putting the number in 4, 3, 2, whatever. It can just take you there. Now you can do this with just putting the number 1 in. That should do the same thing. But for example, last child, you might not know what the last child is, especially if the user information is generated based on how much data there is. It's not easy to know the exact number. So that's why things like this are very useful for larger websites, for websites that you'll probably be working on. So first child, you can do background green, and for last child, you can do background purple. And it's as simple as that. You select the last child and first child by using the double colons and then type in last child. Very simple. Okay, we'll delete these. Now this is a very interesting one. The not selector, in essence, is very simple. You probably won't use it that often, but it is a handy one to know. So essentially what it's saying is so when you say a not selector, you're saying, I want to style everything except for this element or selector. Now in this case, we've selected the first child and the last child not to be styled. So if I put in background blue, everything in the middle will get styled, but the first child and the last child are not styled because we're using the not pseudo class. And all we do for that is use the double colons and not, and then we have the parentheses and we put in whatever it is we don't want in there. So yeah, fairly straightforward, but maybe watch this back a couple times just to make sure you understood it. So let's have a look at some of these very last pseudo classes. So those are link, visited, and active. And you can see visited and active here because they're more important. On the CSS preview, it doesn't actually show up very well for security reasons. But if we go to our Brave browser, we can see how that works. Now I've got an extension here called Live Server. You can go to extensions here and type in Live Server, and then you can download it here. And essentially it runs a server locally on whichever file you're working on. And then you can actually view that file in a browser. And it basically reloads whenever you do a change. So I'll click go live here, and then you can see that once I open it, it now works. So if I visited a link, it should be read. Brilliant. Well, that's the visited pseudo class, but the active pseudo class is slightly different. So when I select over the link with my mouse and left click it and hold it, it should go to the color that I chose, which is red. And the same on the visited class. And then if I click here and then go down, that should go to purple as well because I visited that. And if I get rid of link here, just unhighlight that, you can see that goes back to unvisited. Click visited link here, and now they're both purple. And obviously they both have the active styling, which means it's red. And if I change that to green, that should change as well. So those are the main pseudo classes you need to know about, and you get an idea of how you can use them and how you can work around them if you get issues. So yeah, and there we go. That is pseudo classes. So as you've finished your CSS section, this is the one thing that's going to round it all off for you as we go through some of the best practices that I would use in CSS. These are your North Stars for making sure that when you work on enterprise level code, you work on it in the best way possible. Now, some of these tips and tricks I've used since I was a junior right up to now, and they haven't failed. These are excellent tips. These are excellent best practices, and they are really going to help you in all the projects and all the jobs that you're going to have after this video. So I've made a list here of some of our best practices, and the goal is obviously to write efficient, maintainable, and scalable CSS, and that's what these tips and tricks help you do. Now we've got a list of about 10, so let's start with our first one. Now this is to use a CSS reset or normalize style sheet. Now if you've never heard of one of these, I'll show you exactly what that is now. So this is what CSS reset is. So I'm on this beautiful website, mayaweb.com, and it essentially shows you what a reset style sheet is. It takes all the default browser stylings and takes them right back to basics and completely unifies the styling. So for example here, it's basically saying margin 0, padding 0, border 0 on everything that has margin padding by default. So there's a bunch of block elements here that would have this default box size styling on it. It kind of standardizes the line height and everything else. So that's essentially what a reset style sheet is. It resets everything back to a standard, everything back to scratch. So really, almost you have no styling, but you do have a very little bit and it's standardized. So it's a style sheet like this that you might copy. And then if you go into VS Code, we'll create a new style sheet. So we'll say it's a CSS file. And there we go. That is a style sheet. So you can call it reset.css or whatever you want. That's absolutely fine. I've just created a scratch CSS, which just means a throwaway file in VS Code. And this will reset all your styling on your web page if you insert it in. So maybe in here, you create a reset.css, copy all that, put it into here, save it, and then essentially you link it. Oops. So reset.css, and we'll say the type is style sheet. And there you go. Now you've added a reset style sheet to your website. And it's as simple as that. Now the next one is the idea that we want to try and keep your CSS as modular and organized as possible. So there's a few ways to do it. One of the core ways is obviously using BEM, which you've already gone over, block element modifier. But there are ways to even take that and break it down into smaller pieces, and I'll show you how that works. So essentially, you think of styling in a very different way. So imagine you've got like a feature or a component, and you want to break it down into smaller bits. So you add class names that, for example, only affect the title, the description, and the button. So they've all got their own separate class names, and that is using modular CSS, breaking it down into smaller, more manageable class names. And obviously this is done for effect. If you imagine an element or a component as like a toy, then you've got the head, the headgear, the backpack, the torso, and the legs. Those could all be separate class names. And in the same way, when you're building something for the web, try and think of it, what is the most modular way you can break it down so you can target it in the styling. And when you target it in the styling, it needs to be semantic, where it makes sense that when you call the class name, you know exactly where in the website it is and what its use is. And that is proper modular CSS. And the third one is using descriptive class names. So again, piggybacking off modular CSS, we're talking about block element modifier here. Now, if you're using a native CSS, this is a great naming convention to use. So if we have a look at BEM here, it's essentially the idea of having a name for your class name that makes sense, the block, and then you have the element, which is the view more button, and we have a modifier here, which is to say if it's inactive, style it like this, and at each point it has different styling. And this naming convention is a proving naming convention. So if you're ever using just CSS, I would suggest using block element modifier. Now, if you haven't watched the CSS Crash Course, I would suggest you go back and watch it, because that shows you in more detail all about the block element modifier convention. And this one is also a best practice. So remember how we have class names, IDs, and tags as a way to select our HTML? Well, we actually don't want to use ID as often as you might think. Every ID is essentially meant to be unique. You can't have IDs that are both the same. So they have to have very high specificity. So IDs are great for when you're doing testing and you're writing basically elements that you want for your QA team to test those particular elements, but you don't want it so that everything is using an ID, because it's not really considered a best practice. It's only meant to be used sparingly for high specificity. So try and use class names as often as you can. Number 5, which is leverage your CSS processes. Now, what does CSS processes mean? Well, you've got your native CSS, which we've had a look at, your .css style sheets, or your CSS in general you can put into HTML. But there is a level above that, and this is a slightly more advanced way of using CSS, and that is through using a CSS processor like Sass. Now, Sass is one of the most common ones. It's one of the most popular ones, and I'll show you what that is just now. So Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, and I've been using this since I was a junior for a very long time. It is one of the most convenient ways to style your CSS. And one of the best things about Sass, in this case SCSS, which is different to Sass, FYI, most people use SCSS, is that basically CSS makes you or forces you to write everything on a new line. You can't nest stuff in CSS. Whereas in Sass, you can actually nest stuff, and it is such a great quality of life improvement. And yeah, this is one of the big things about Sass that has made it so popular. Nesting is huge. Being able to use modules, so you can import entire style sheets as modules. So you could have a CSS reset style sheet in here, for example, or you could import fonts very easily, all kinds of stuff like that. You can even use variables, so you can create a variable. So you can say, I'm going to create a color variable called primary and set it to 333. And then I don't have to type in 333 every single time. I just use primary color and it automatically knows what it is. And if I want to change the primary color in all my style sheets, I just change it on this one line here. And it's so powerful. So yeah, pre-processors like this are amazing, quite easy to set up. So yeah, have a go, have a play around with this. We will go through this in detail later, but this is a really good thing to be using as a best practice. Try to aim towards using CSS preprocessors. And number 6, optimize for performance. So a lot of the times when you put a style sheet up, it is as it is. It's got lots of spaces in it. So for example, if we go here, so you can see here, there's lots of spaces, there's lots of gaps everywhere. But if you were to minimize a style sheet, you wouldn't have any of these spaces. It would literally probably all be on one line. And I can show you an example of that. So this is a CSS minifier. And if I grab that style sheet that we were using earlier, the reset one, and paste it into here, and then I click minify, look at how it's minified all of that CSS. It's literally just put it onto a few lines. And essentially, it's not really human readable, but that's fine. It's not meant for humans to read that. This is, so you can edit it. This is only used for performance reasons. So this is just in the background to be used on your website. And when you do build a website and push it to production, generally this is how it looks in the style sheet, because you're not editing the style sheet once it's in production and on its live. You're only just using it for the styling. So it doesn't need to be all spaced out like this. And some of the huge benefits are that you save on a lot of space. So you save on a lot of space, you improve load times, and there are some common ones that you can use. So purge CSS and uncss that help automate those processes. Check those out and make sure that you do minify your CSS files, and you can do that in the build process. And if you're not sure what that is, Google that, and when we start moving on to our next projects and you start building your projects with the tools that we're going to use, you'll start to see that the JavaScript files and the CSS files will all be minified just like you've seen there. Number 7 is make sure you use Flexbox CSS and Grid CSS for layouts, just as a best practice for using the most responsive layout system that is available to you in CSS currently. My vote would be to Flexbox. So as we went through this in a previous video, this is something that I would use to organize your layouts. It's very quick, very fast, and you're probably using it quite a lot already. So just probably stick to it, master it, and get really good at it before you start moving on to CSS Grid and things like that. But yeah, this is a great one to use a lot. And number 8 is to maintain your styles and colors. So if you're creating a theme or a design system or even a component library, you want to make sure that all your fonts, your colors, and everything is of a consistent style. And you can do that through using something called CSS variables. So if you go here, you can actually see how to set a CSS variable. So you can see CSS variable in action, and these are set in your root of your DOM. And essentially you can access these anywhere and just call on this main BG color, and that should work. And you can use these like this. So if I make this bigger, background color, and then your variable main BG color, and you set it like this. And one of the ways you can add this to your website is if I grab this style here, we'll go back to our index.html, and in the style block here at the top, you can do this in your style sheet as well. We'll add root and we'll have the main color as red. We'll say main BG color, or we'll change that to primary color. Then if we go to our website and we refresh that, we can see that we've now set that variable in the document to be used whenever we want. So then if I say border var primary color, it automatically completes it for me. I refresh that. Oops, I'll just make sure we set this to 2 pixels dashed. Refresh that, and you can see now using that CSS variable, we've added a border around the entire website, and it literally is as simple as that. So that is CSS variables. And this one goes without saying. We already briefly mentioned this in the CSS Crash Course, but try to use media queries as less as possible. You want to try and use Flexbox as much as you can to handle all the responsiveness. So things like Flex Wrap, if we can find it. Yep. So Flex Wrap. So this kind of handles a lot of your responsive stuff. And generally, you just want to make sure you use properties like that to make your website responsive without having to use media queries. And finally, we want to make sure that we use comments as much as we can, as often as possible, because what that does is if you put comments in the right place and you put forward your thought pattern, when another developer or even future you comes back a long time later and wants to understand the reasoning behind why something has been done the way it has, they've got a breadcrumb trail to follow and learn from the last person who worked on it. Now, a lot of the times what you don't want to do, which is a trap that juniors can fall into, is try to over comment everything. You don't need to over comment everything, because if you do, you're kind of like stating the obvious. So if I go here, for example, if I go to the HTML here and I go title, and then I go Flexbox container section, this stuff isn't needed because the text here tells you exactly what's going on. So it's all really redundant. And the title is, because it's the H1, you know it's a title. So these are all really redundant titles. What can be useful is something like this. So for example, Maya Webb, whose reset style sheet we just used, this gives information about the style sheet, the version number. So things like that can be important. Or you can say, for example, I reset these to have no box model spacing because of Chromium default browser styling. And what that is doing is that saying why I've grouped all these together and the reasoning behind it. So that's a much more powerful and meaningful comment than just stating the obvious as to what it is. So it's a bit of an art form and you need a bit of practice, but getting into a good practice of commenting when required is a really good best practice to have for CSS. And there we go. That is our top 10 CSS best practices. Use them as your North Star for when you're writing CSS, and you won't go wrong. And a lot of these you're going to keep with you right until the point you're a senior developer. So go forth and style.